Hello. Nice to see you again, thank you.
From off of the Viz.
From off of the Viz.
I was one of the founders. And I don't mean that I found it under a hedge, which is where most people find dirty magazines. I mean that me and my brother and our friend invented it.
I just looked online and a copy of the very first episode, issue of this, is now worth around £900.
Oh. Well, do you know what? The interesting thing is, issue 1 isn't the rarest one.
Is it not?
Issue 2 there was only ever 500 of issue 2. Because what we didn't realise when we were young, because we were just teenagers when we started this, we put limited edition on the front, but we didn't realise that nobody's ever in the room with all of the comics and able to count exactly how many of them you've printed. And the other thing that we didn't realise, we hadn't actually mentioned how many it was limited to. So we could have just kept, we didn't reprint it basically, but issue 1 was reprinted two or three times at least, so it's not as rare as issue 2. Issue 2's worth more than issue 1, although that's entirely dependent on who wants it and whether they're prepared to part with it.
Yeah, so, you know, but that time there was no internet, no mobile phones, so how did you peddle this magazine? Did you go on the streets and do it yourself?
We quite literally just went. Well, the first place it was ever sold was a pub where we used to go to watch bands, Gosforth Hotel, Gosforth High Street, which is also where Mr. Sting out of the Pigs started his career. So the room, the upstairs function room of the Gosforth Hotel, is called the Gordon Sumner Suite because that's Mr. Sting out of the Police's real name. But there's also, they have things on the wall commemorating the fact that it was the first place Biz was sold as well. So we used to go along there, we were underage, but we used to go along to sell our comic to the people who used to go to watch the bands, which included ourselves as well. There was an upstairs function room where it was, I mean, I look at the size of that room now and realise that we sold nearly 150 comics on the first night that it was ever sold. And I think that the current fire safety regulations on that room are 70. So, I mean, how many people were in there? This is in the days of sort of punk rock bands. I mean, there was no stage, and the sort of band were like crushed against the wall with all of the fans right up to their faces, you know. And we used to just sit on the door and sell them. And we used to sell them around the pubs locally as well. We grew up in Heaton and Jesmond, and so we used to sell them at the all the pubs where the kids from school used to have it around, you know what I mean? And then we got into shops. Independent record shops were the first people who really, because fanzines were a big thing at the time. People who made magazines, usually like a very DIY homemade magazine, usually a very sort of specific targeted audience, which would be the fans of a particular band, and it was usually music at the time. Fanzines are a bit more spread now to cover more subjects, but then it was usually just a particular band or a particular music scene. And because we were independently produced and we were always there on the music scene with the guys who did similar things, we ended up just doing things the way they did them, and that sort of punk rock ethic of homemade fanzines and everything was a big player in how Viz was launched.
So when was the moment when it really exploded?
Well, it kind of got, it's interesting because there were sort of explosions all along the line, really, from that first, because the first time we ever sold Viz, we didn't know if anybody would be interested at all. And then we were delighted when a few people at the pub showed an interest and bought it, and then within literally within a couple of hours, we'd sold as many as we had printed. So, you know, we'd sold.
How did you print them then?
Well, there was commercial printing at the time was far too expensive for us to be involved in it, but there was a place down in Carlisle Square, just off Westgate Road, called the Tyneside Free Press Workshop. And the guys in there were basically a cooperative who tried to print things as cheaply as possible. They were mainly, they were mainly sort of, I don't think they were themselves overtly political, but they tended to do like protest magazines and booklets that, you know, basically it was people who had an urge to get something that they felt was important printing but couldn't afford to go to commercial printers, all ended up there. So a lot of them were people who were making sort of independent statements, you know, often they were often left-wing political things. And of course the irony was that some of the guys who ran the place were real sort of left-wing, softy hippies, but then they had to employ printers from the print world who, you know, weren't so bothered about the ethics of the whole thing. And they used to like operate the presses possibly more, the presses were probably in action more when the place was closed than when it was open and the money was all going under the counter. You know. So there was a lot of govy work went on, but they were great guys, and we printed Viz there, and it was still expensive. I mean, my brother was working at the ministry in Long Benton, so we had like a horrible office, soulless office job. But he made money, and the money was enough to pay to get Viz printed. And it was almost like what you would call we were just printing it for ourselves, you know, like a sort of I can't know, the words escape it, and like people who print stuff just really for their own egos.
Like a private press.
Yeah. So they, we printed it not knowing if anybody else would be interested. And it turned out loads of people were. And it sort of turned out that we had accidentally put knob jokes in print for the first time, really. I mean, people look back now, with hindsight, we look back and say, oh, well, you know, there was this kind of humour everywhere. There's a bit of it in Shakespeare, you know, it's everywhere.
Chaucer in particular.
Yeah, Chaucer was massively, it was no gad.
In fact, apparently the earliest joke ever recorded is a Sumerian fart joke, which is over 5,000 years old.
Wow, I bet that one smells really bad, right?
What was it like then? Because there's the moment when the big boys, the big sharks approach you and go, oh, you got something here, can we take it on?
Well, that was actually something that we were unaware of, was that this was launched in 1979, so really we're talking about the early 80s. We launched in December of 79, and as the 80s sort of trundled on, we didn't know it, but the big publishing houses were all desperate to find a magazine that young men would buy, because women of all ages bought loads of magazines at the time. But young men, after they read comics, some of them then got into maybe comics for older boys, like, you know, special interests on like football comics. But then generally some of them would move maybe into specialist areas like music magazines they would buy when they were young men. But if you weren't into music, you know, and they're not talking great numbers either for these publications in the world of big publishing houses.
So is this just before the era of like lads mags?
Yeah, lads mags didn't exist, and it's literally the case that 18 to 24-year-old men did not buy magazines at all. So they knew, the publishing world knew, that if you could produce something that would sell to these people, you were on to something golden in the world of publishing. And there was a couple of people from publishing houses. There was a guy called Bob Painter, and another guy called John Brown, and they were both watching the TV one afternoon when a show called Sparks was broadcast, and it was a BBC Two community program unit, programs made by young people for young people, one of those deals. We used to laugh a lot at community television, youth TV, but actually looking back, it was absolutely brilliant what it really did. A lot of people that we know now, including the lads of Ben Elton, had their first foray into national publicity through these things. So we were approached by this show. We'd been approached by one called Something Else, and we were on that in 1981. And then in 83 we did this show called Sparks. And Sparks was all about young people who were doing it for themselves. And so these two guys, totally independently of each other, happened to be watching the TV. And they saw that there was these three young guys in Newcastle who were producing this magazine that sold to all of these young people. Because one of the things that we did on the show, we went down to the Card Bar, which had become one of the biggest sellers of this in Newcastle, the Handyside Arcade. I mean, both Brian and the arcade now sadly gone.
I saw my first computer game there as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was a brilliant. It was basically the teenagers of Newcastle had thrived on discovering who they were in the Card Bar and Handyside arcades, right back in the early '60s. And so we filmed in there with this show Sparks, and these guys sitting watching it realised that our audience was these people that they couldn't touch. So they both went, whoa, that's interesting. And by the Monday morning, John Brown had forgotten about it, but Bob Painter was straight on the phone. He found us in the phone book, and he got straight onto us, and he worked for IPC, Fleetwood Publications, and I can't remember what they were called at the time. They were either that and then they switched to the other, or vice versa. But they had this huge office block on the south bank of the River Thames. They took us down there on a train and explained exactly what I've just said to you guys now, that we were exactly what they were looking for. And all we had to do was produce for them a dummy issue. It's a little bit like, The Apprentice. So we had to pretend that we were working for them for a couple of months, produce an issue which wouldn't really go to the shops.
Right.
It would just be for them to look at.
So did they ask you to change the nature of what you were making?
This is where it got interesting, because obviously to you and I, and anybody who ever picked up a copy of this at the time, what made it special was the fact that it contained stuff that wasn't in other magazines.
The sense of anarchy.
Yeah, it was basically summed up perfectly by a journalist once who said that what we had done was we'd taken the cosy world of British comics and introduced the stark realities of northern street life. So, it was the juxtaposition between those two things which made it funny. You know what I mean? You've got this cosy world and then horrible things going on in it. And things that we're all familiar with, and like I touched on before, childish humour was what it was. But I mean, everybody loves, you say childish humour, what do you mean by that? A joke's a joke, you know what I mean? And I remember Michael Palin was a great inspiration to me when on a radio interview once about the life of Brian when I was about 15, he was interviewed. And the interviewer accused him, pardon me, of reveling in postgraduate humour. And my friend went, oh no, it's schoolboy humour. And I went, own it, you know what I mean? There's nothing wrong with that. But I mean, humour is a very personal thing, but of course, to these young men who were picking up this, there wasn't anything in magazines for them. But then there was this whole world of these kind of jokes that we all thought we only had with our friends. But it turns out everyone has them with their friends group as well, So these guys thrived on producing magazines that sold to lots of people. And the way they normally did that was by means of lowest common denominator factors. So they had to take out anything that was too extreme or that they saw as being too extreme. So they were absolutely perplexed by the fact that our magazine had, you know, foul language in it, for instance, and sort of these kind of jokes that they didn't get in a sense as well. They didn't get jokes without punchlines, for instance. And you know, we'd grown up, as I've already touched on, with Monty Python. Monty Python had done that thing where they thrived on finding where the funny was in a sketch. And if it didn't have an ending, that didn't really matter, because you got the thing was, with a lot of those sketches in the 60s, you know, with Derek and Clive and all the sort of forerunners to Python, there was this world that forced on them, this world of expectation forced on them, you have to have a punchline. Sometimes a punchline would ruin the joke, you know.
Spike Milligan in the 70s, his TV shows always used to sort of almost end on awkward silence as they ran out and didn't have a punchline.
Yeah. But anyway, so these people, these big publishers, they wanted Viz, but they didn't want its contents. And we sort of said to them at the end of this sort of 2-month job interview, we said, well, it isn't anything without that. You're taking out everything that it is and expecting it to work. It's like, you know, it's like we want a car, but we don't want an engine or a drive system of any kind, and we don't want any seats. We don't want any luggage space or wheels, but we want a car that will get us from A to B. And that was the kind of world that we're in. We're facing with these people. You want everything that we're producing, but you don't want any of it at the same time. So obviously it was never going to work. So eventually we got the brush off from them. You know, they wanted us to change so many things. I'll give you an idea. Sid the Sexist became Sid the Smooth Talker.
Really?
Yeah. And they didn't get the idea that he wasn't successful with women. You know, they kind of that, they didn't like Mr. Logic either. Mr. Logic used literal words to describe things because he was logical. And they didn't get that, so they put in slang terms instead, which completely changed what and they didn't, you know, so they just didn't get the fundamentals of what they were looking at. And so it was a disaster with them. They brushed us off, and then it turned out that the guy Bob Baker, who initially communicated with us, he scribbled a little note on the final letter that they sent to us saying, look, it's not going to work. You know, here's a few quid to buy yourself some sweets, and you know, thank you, good night, sort of thing. But then he scribbled on the bottom, because you know, this was in the days of big offices where your letters would be typed in a typing pool, and then they would be sent back to your desk to be signed. And when he signed it, he scribbled along the bottom, why don't you try Richard Branson? So Virgin Records, we were familiar with dealing with independent record shops, and we went, yeah, Virgin have got loads of record shops around the country. And we didn't know it at the time, but the Virgin record shops, or we didn't realise the significance of it, should I say. The Virgin record shops operated like independent record shops, in that the staff in the shops chose what they sold locally.
Right.
So the Virgin shop in Newcastle was selling 1,000 copies of Fizz per issue. So my brother wrote to Richard Branson. The letter never got to Branson, but it went to Virgin.
Yeah.
And this letter said, look, you know, you've got 32 shops around the UK. We sell 1,000 comics in each one. If we could sell 1,000 in each of your shops, that would be a viable business. Are you interested in publishing the magazine? And the guy, John Brown, who had been watching that show Sparks, it ended up on his desk, and he ran Virgin Vision, which was mainly VHS video at the time. We're talking 1985, so they were doing like music video and stuff. But they also did books. Virgin did very few books. at the time, but it went through the Virgin Vision business. So John had seen us on Sparks and he really liked what he'd seen. I think one of the reasons why he'd not jumped was because they didn't do magazines. So unlike the guy at IPC, he hadn't jumped at the opportunity to come and talk to us. But what he thought, well, if we do books, maybe we could do magazines, you know. And he came and he met us, and straight away, he met us in Willow Tees in Jesmond. Actually, he flew up from London straight away after reading the letter. And he said to his secretary, he says, right, I'm going to fly up there straight away. And he got out of the aeroplane, through the airport building, straight into a taxi and said, Lily Crescent. And the taxi driver said, where's that? And he said, Jesmond. The taxi driver said, where's that? And he said, Newcastle. And the taxi driver says, oh right. He says, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll take you to the railway station because this is Teesside. So apart from flying to the wrong airport, he'd done very well. He came to me, he met us in Willow Tees, and one of the first things that he said to us, he was full of questions, fired questions off at you all the time. I think sometimes he wasn't interested in the answers to any of these questions, but if he kept asking you questions, it stopped you from asking him any. Do you know what I mean?
Okay, yeah.
So he took control of the situation by just firing out questions. And the first thing that he said that wasn't the question was, he said, well, obviously, if I were to publish this, the one thing that I would really have to commit to is allowing you to be completely in charge of the contents of the magazine. Because if I were to fiddle with it in any way, it would ruin what it is. And we went,
He's the guy.
This is the guy, yeah. So he then gave us a contract which actually results in this still existing in the same format to this day. And the contract, the publishing contract, actually states that the publisher has no control over the editorial content of the magazine. Now, no publisher would have put that in writing.
Yeah.
No publisher, but he wasn't a publisher. It wasn't what he did. So he put it in writing to put our minds at rest that he wasn't going to interfere. But of course, the knock-on effect was that we absolutely continued to do what we... He only made one proviso, which was that he would have a libel lawyer look over every issue before it went to press.
Yeah.
And if there was anything libelous in it, we would talk to the solicitor about it first. If the solicitor signed it off, he was covered by insurance. So we learned over the years just how to run the absolute finest line between what's legal and what isn't. You know?
Yeah.
And that was why a lot of people saw us as being so edgy and daring. Well, I guess we were edgy and daring, but we were just kids. We didn't. I think when you're that engaged in the exuberance of youth, you know what I mean. You kind of don't necessarily. You're not necessarily aware of exactly what you could be up against. So we went practice. You know what I mean. We just said we did anything we wanted.
I mean, it was phenomenally successful for a lot of years. I think you said last time we talked that you were like second only to the Radio Times in terms of viewership.
We were the top, in British newsagents, we were the top magazine apart from the Radio and TV Times, which at the time couldn't print each other's listings. So lots of people bought both. So that interfered with the figures. Mind you, so did the fact that the way the figures in the publishing industry work is per issue. The Radio Times is weekly and we were every 8 weeks. So they actually sold loads more than we
I'd still take it as a win.
But at the same time, there was an interesting figure that came up in the research done by the publisher, which was we were by far the magazine in the UK that had the biggest readership who weren't necessarily buyers. So every comic was passed around and reckoned up between 6 to 8 people.
Yeah.
So
Could you convince advertisers of that?
Sorry?
Could you convince advertisers of that?
Well, that was the interesting thing. That was why that research was done, was to show to the prospective advertisers. But getting back to Brian and the card bar, Handyside Arcade, Brian was somebody who used to sell things to teenagers, and
That sounds wrong.
yeah, but he never really understood what he was selling to them. He just knew that, this is the latest thing, and but he was very wise on a business front, and he knew how teenagers' minds operated. And the advice he gave us, which was really led to some of the greatest success we had, was that he saw that there was a problem that we faced, which was it was difficult for us to raise enough revenue to make this worthwhile financially for ourselves. Now, it paid for itself, but it was one of those things where, the more you printed, the cheaper it got, but there were all the distribution costs because we were doing it ourselves involved. So he was saying what you need to do to make it pay to look after you as well as itself, you need to take on advertising so it can become a job and you can give up doing the other things you do. So we said, but we cannot take advertising because it goes against what we do. It doesn't work. If you put an advert in Viz, it would clash with what we do. And he said, but teenagers, he said, if you allow yourself to be the butt of a joke, teenagers think you're cool.
Yeah.
It's about you. If you're able to laugh at yourself, teenagers respect that, It's the one thing that they'll do. Well, of the two guaranteed things that they'll do, they'll think someone who can laugh at themselves is cool, and they'll also think anyone who bigs themselves up is not cool, right? So if you advertise yourself, chances are teenagers will think you're not cool, right? So what he did was, he said, you can put an advert in your comic for my shop, and you can say whatever you want about my business. I don't care what you say, but I'll pay for the advert. Right?
Yeah.
And it set a trend. So we basically then had an advertising policy, which was, we will design your advert. You can't design it yourself. We'll say whatever we want about your business. We guarantee you that it will be derogatory. We will put your business down. We'll say bad things about what you do at Friendly Services. And if you don't like it, we'll print it anyway, even if you don't pay for it, right?
So, the Comic House, the Parley's Comic House, was that one of the people that was at this?
Sorry, say that again?
Was it the Parley? There was a Comic
Oh,
House.
Parley,
in
yeah.
Newcastle.
That was many years later. Lord Harpole ran the Curry House. He interestingly, Lord Harpole, bless him, he died at the age of 53 of a heart attack, but he was a wonderful supporter of ours. He was somebody who very much embraced that ethic. He knew, in a sense, there was no such thing as bad publicity. If he was a mad keen self-publicist, and he went out of his way to always get mentioned. He wanted to be mentioned in the press wherever he could, so people were just aware that his business existed, And so he did a thing where he would let us just say whatever we wanted about his Curry House. And he used to, in payment, he didn't used to pay for his ads. What he used to do, he used to feed everyone in the office on our deadline weekends. And he would literally come down the office himself with all of this hot food from his restaurant, which wasn't very far away. And we would all have this massive slap-up meal in the office on nights of deadline. But yeah, but the initial ads, some businesses didn't get it. There was a guy called Martin Keegan who ran Phase. I don't know if you remember the fashion shop on High Bridge. It's like a punk fashion shop. And we did an advert for him and he hated it. So it was me dressed in like the worst jumble sale clothes I could find. Like massive flared check trousers and and like the early 1970s, like tank top, all the stuff that was absolutely not what he sold, you know? And it was all done in the worst sort of graphics. Totally went against his shop, you know. He hated it. He said, I'm not paying for that. It's awful, you know. And then what happened was, people started to come into his shop and say, hey, love your advert. That's so cool, you know. And he went, oh, yeah, yeah. And then he paid for his ad, and then he got us in to design all of his brochures for him, you know. So it was like,
could one thing I've kind of...
counterintuitive.
Sorry,
Yeah.
go ahead. Oh, but right. Yeah, one thing I've kind of wondered, because obviously after a while you kind of handed the business over, and other people have been working with characters that you designed. How was that? Was it very strange to get used to?
Well, for anyone who doesn't know, probably, and I assume most people don't. The way it worked was the three of us set Viz up, me and my brother and our friend Jim. Jim got out of doing Viz very early on. I say very early on, he worked with us for 6 years. So, but Viz we hadn't signed our publishing deal yet, so we were still just independent. And he went into working with a property developer. He was being the sensible guy, you know? He went into to working in an industry that wasn't. I mean, what we were doing was still entirely unproven in terms of, like I was saying, you know, it was able to pay for itself, but it didn't give us wages. It didn't give us any income. It didn't give us any potential future that we were aware of. So Jim he took the sensible route, and then a couple of other guys came along in the following. Well, actually, before Jim left, Graham and Julie came along, and then Simon Thorpe, and they began working with me and my brother, and the four of us became the team who created almost everything that everybody knows from Viz.
Right.
Then in '99, my brother stopped working on Viz, and 4 years later, I stopped working on it, which is
So it's more of a smooth
20 years ago now.
Yeah.
But the guys who produce Viz now are the two who came in '84, '85, so it's not actually changed hands. There's been a lot of stories in the press, two particularly damaging ones. Not particularly damaging, I mean damaging to people's understanding rather than damaging financially or anything like that. But there was a guy from Reuters who was looking at this business exchanges on the stock exchange one day, and he read that Viz had been sold to another company, but he misunderstood what he was looking at, because it was the contract for Viz, so the publishing contract, and 3 other titles, had been sold by one publisher to another publisher. So what didn't actually involve the creative side, it was just, so if you imagine we were, for argument's sake, I just use this metaphor because it's easy for people to understand. So if the 4 of us were the Beatles, so Parlophone sold the Beatles publishing contract to Decca.
Yeah.
Didn't affect the Beatles. The Beatles would still keep making their records exactly the same way, and they would still get their royalties. So that was what happened. It went from one publishing house to another. But this guy read on the stock exchange figures that Viz had been sold, and it had been sold to this guy's business, James Brown. Confusingly, another guy called Brown had bought it. So John Brown sold it to James Brown, and the confusion came in that he understood it that me and my brother had sold Viz to James Brown, the Loaded founder. So it was James Brown who was behind the company IFG, but he hadn't got any. Once again, go back to this contract. He had no control over what Viz was.
Right.
He just gained control of the publishing rights. And then it was sold on to another publisher after that. But once again, it didn't change anything. The guys who are the creative team behind this remains the same, you know, although maybe brother aren't involved.
And so, which Beatle are you?
I'm Rick. No, my brother would be Pete Best.
Right.
No, hang on, he wouldn't. He'd have to be cooler than Pete Best. He'd be the one who died in the original bass player who died.
Klaus Bormann?
No, Klaus Bormann was friends with Klaus Bormann. Stu Sutcliffe.
That's it.
Yeah. No, Jim's Stu Sutcliffe, isn't he? Jim's Stu Sutcliffe. Stu died as well. So yeah, Jim is definitely Stu Sutcliffe. The analogy's breaking down at this point because the thing is the Beatles would have to still be going, but there'd only be 2 original members.
To kind of wrap it up and stay on the musical theme, how was it to see Shaking Stevens have a single out there?
Jesus, Shakin's new singles. Has anyone heard Shakin's new single? Seriously, remember when Johnny Cash came back? And he was cooler than he'd ever been. It's in the mold of John. Honestly,
The black
listen
suit and
to it.
everything. Yeah.
But the lyrics are brilliant. The music's brilliant. Much better than anything. Now, you know, Shakin' Stevens was shit, wasn't he? I mean, we all know that, right? But no, it's brilliant. It's got a brilliant band. It's a brilliant song. The lyrics are amazing. It's all about how greed has taken over in this country. You know. I think we all know what that's about. And it's called All You Need Is Greed, isn't it?
Yeah.
Really,
Great song. Yeah.
really good song.
So,
Listen to it. Yeah.
you're still in love with comedy.
He's the best player Fulchester United ever fielded. Super soul.
So you still love your comedy. You do amazing stand-up, especially Barry Twyford.
Why, thank you.
He's one of my favourite characters of all time. Who makes you laugh now?
On the comedy circuit.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of your readers may be aware that there's a sort of a world of comedy acts who don't get on TV a lot, but who are massive on the comedy club circuit. And some of the local ones who tour the UK, and they've been doing it for years, and they're sort of almost unrecognised on TV. My favourite throughout all the years I've worked in stand has got to be Gavin Webster.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
Unbelievable. But he's been around for years. But there's also young acts out there now. There's some. I mean, it's amazing. I don't know if you've seen any of the stuff the women's shows that they've done at the Time Theatre for International Women's Day.
Yeah, I went to the last one.
It's great process. There's so many great young women in comedy. I almost feel like I don't want to start naming them all. But, I mean, Louise Young, she caught my eye the first time I saw her, and she's now been signed by a big agent, so you probably will see her on TV before long. There's a few underrated ones. Me and Alex from Viz many years ago, more than 20 years ago now, we judged a competition that was run by Golden Wonder for stand-ups, and we judged the North East Heat, and there was a young, very eccentric young guy came along at the time, Seymour Mace. He's still on the circuit now, and he's brilliant. He won. We voted him in, so you know I'm not bragging, mate, but he'd be nothing if it wasn't for us. No, Seymour's brilliant. Underrated comic, and I feel like I should name one of the younger ones that are just starting out.
Have you seen Shay Raper?
No, but I've heard.
He's amazing. He could be a character that you could have written. He's absolute genius.
There's some, I've heard just in the last couple of years there's some really good new acts on the circuit, so I'll be checking them out. I mean, it's always brilliant if you get down the stand to see one on Wednesday night, you know, to the new acts at Red Raw. But no, I love the comedy circuit, and it's always thriving, you know. I actually saw a comic in London. I was working in London last weekend. There was a guy on. He's one of these strange people who just comes along. He must be over 60, must be 65, and he's just starting out as a stand-up, and he was absolutely fantastic. I can't remember his name, but he was one of them people who's just a joke machine, you know. And I'll tell you I'll tell you one of his jokes off there. Because he was a bit fruity like, but
So if people want, do you have a gig lined up in the next couple of weeks that people like to come and see you do your stand-up routine would be able to see you?
I probably do, but I can't think where. I know I'm working, I've got gigs at the stand I'm working at Aberdeen next weekend, and then I'm at the stand in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And I've got a film. Yeah, well, I'm on in what's it called? They had it. It's on the road. It's on. I'm going to start a game off here where we're going to try and work out where the gig is. It's on the road to Sunderland, and there's East and West, Westbourne. It's one of them, and they've got a pub, and it's there. There's a lot of pubs in Eastbourne and Westbourne. It's a nice one. It's the
I'm sure if you
one.
try them all, they'll find you eventually.
I've got that's coming up very soon. I'm not sure when it is, but it's soon. And I don't, if you're familiar with Felt Now, they put on a lot of gigs in the
they're doing
North.
great work.
I'm always doing gigs for them, so check out their website. Oh, I've got a bus tour coming up as well. So that's sold out, so there's no point in doing it. But there'll be another one coming up. I'm doing bus tour gigs with my brother.
And you're signing things downstairs?
I'm signing things downstairs, yeah. I'm doing drawings. I still do drawings. And I can draw something for you. Draw the curtains.
One of your pictures has pride of place in my downstairs bathroom, so every time I
Do you want to hear one last quick story?
Yes.
I bumped into Mr. Sting off the Police at a charity event. And it's the first time I had a chance to speak to him, like ever, you know. And I was just talking to him, and my friend Angie stepped up, and she's one of those very professional people who introduces people to one another and make contacts and networks. Anyway, she steps up and she says, so she says, turns to Sting and says, do you know Simon from Viz? He was one of the creators of Viz. And Mr. Sting says, oh, Viz! He says, Viz, brilliant. He says, I've got everything you've ever written about me on my toilet wall. Right? And I said, oh, really? Because we've written some very interesting things about him, right? So I said, how does that go down with people? And he says, he says the Americans, they come out and they say, oh my God, what the hell is that? I say to them, it's Viz, man. And that's all he tells them. It's Viz, man.
Take the man out of joy hand.
Yeah.
Well, mate, it's always a massive pleasure.
Thank you
I
very
want to
much.
finish up my favourite reader's letter of all time, so if you can finish it for me.
Yes.
I recently sent my 4-year-old down to the shops. Can you finish it, please?
To buy a loaf of bread and a packet of biscuits. You'll never guess, what was it?
Imagine my surprise.
Imagine my surprise when he returned with a both of Lorette and a packet of biscuits.
Love it. Cheers, mate. We'll see you downstairs.
All right.
Cheers. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.